Now let's turn toward looking at the effects on markets for labor from something like capital investment, where we're investing more in, say, machinery, building new factories and the like. Right? So we have some additional amount of capital investment, then we're wondering what happens in the market for labor. Well, here, it really matters whether capital is a substitute or a complement for labor. After all, it is perfectly possible that capital and labor are substitutes, which really just means that capital and labor would tend to do the same kinds of jobs, so that you have the more you have of one, the less useful the other one is to you. Right? In that case, one way that we could think of this is that having more capital makes labor less productive on the margin. That is, we can imagine an assembly line. Right? So we have assembly line workers working along that assembly line, then we decide to mechanize part of it. Now we have a bunch of workers that really don't have anything to do. Right? Those workers are now far less productive than before. So if capital and labor are substitutes, then having an additional capital would actually make labor less productive at the margin. As a result, we would have a lower demand for labor. So this really all just works through that productivity of labor. Now, the interesting thing that I think is often difficult for people to get their heads around is that here it is actually true that the capital is making labor less productive, because the labor has nothing to add to that productive process anymore. Now, on the other hand, it is perfectly possible that capital and labor are complements. This would be the case if more capital made labor more productive on the margin. Now, this is typically the case where, say, the laborers would be using this capital to improve their productivity. So, for example, we could imagine, say, taking a seamstress and giving the seamstress a sewing machine. A sewing machine was naturally going to increase her productivity substantially, and in doing so, it makes the seamstress far more valuable to us. Right? Therefore, we're going to have a higher demand for that labor. Now, the reality is that a particular capital investment can actually cut both ways for different types of workers. One of my favorite examples of this comes from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. The more recent movie, I think the recent one is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Anyway, it's the Johnny Depp version. Right? In that one, you can see Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, he loses his job as a result of a certain capital investment that this company made. Right? Because originally, Mr. Bucket was an assembly line worker. So they made this investment in this piece of capital equipment, and Mr. Bucket lost his job. In other words, the demand for his labor fell precisely because now he had nothing to add to the productive process as an assembly line worker. But by the end of the movie, he gets hired back. I guess, sorry for the spoiler, but he gets hired back because it is actually a happy ending in the end, right? And he's very happy because he got a new job repairing the machine that had replaced him. Well, repairmen, or machine repairmen, are certainly going to be more useful to you the more machines you have. So this is a type of labor that is made more productive the more capital we have. Right? So the same capital can actually affect different laborers in different ways, depending on whether that labor is a substitute or a complement for the capital investment that we're talking about. Now, one point that I'd make out here is that getting these two mixed up can lead to great disaster. Right? If we believe that capital and labor are substitutes, say, and then we're in charge of installing all this new equipment, so we lay off a bunch of workers, we can end up drastically hurting our profits if, in fact, capital and labor were complements in that case. Now, one case where this kind of thing happened in history was with the invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin is largely credited to Eli Whitney, who was a Northerner in the time of slavery. If anything, my guess is he probably would have been against slavery. And the story goes that when he designed the cotton gin, he really thought this was going to be a great blow to the slave system, where he really believed that by having a machine here that could do the work of multiple slaves, it would make slaves less necessary, and therefore slavery would in effect die, as slaves are no longer needed. Instead, the cotton gin had exactly the opposite effect. What it did was make those slave laborers that the slaveholders had in the South more productive. And since the slave laborers were more productive, there was a greater demand for them. Right? So it ends up that in this case, the cotton gin and slave labor were actually complements. And rather than striking some blow to the system of slavery, it actually perhaps helped to lengthen the term in which slavery was economically viable. Now we can see this kind of effect by imagining, say, two different markets. Here, over time, we're looking at what capital accumulation, that is, the investment in more and better capital goods, does to different types of labor. One type of labor we'll see on the left are substitutes for that capital. The other type would be complements to that capital. Now, over time, what we'd expect to happen is we will actually accumulate capital. We build more factories, we invest in new machinery and better machinery and what have you. As that happens, the demand for substitute labor will tend to fall or shift to the left, while at the same time, the demand for complement labor will shift to the right. Now, a very important thing is that often journalists will tend to get this wrong. They will tend to only focus on the left side of the story without including the right side of the story. Where it is perfectly true, it is not in fact false to say, well, this investment destroyed jobs. In all likelihood, it did destroy jobs somewhere, right? And it very well might be these were, say, low-skilled labor jobs. They may have been assembly line worker jobs, is a very common thing, right? So it is perfectly true that some jobs may be destroyed by this investment in capital. But at exactly the same time, other jobs are going to be created by this investment in capital, those jobs that would tend to complement the capital itself. So it is very incomplete to only tell part of that story without including the other part. Exactly how these two are going to balance out is not necessarily clear, especially considering the case that when you look at a particular capital investment, on the one hand, there's substitute labor that will be harmed by this investment. Complement labor will be helped. But at the same time, these machines do not just pop out of the ground, typically. Normally, you have to have some people that are working to make the machines. So, on net, how this is going to affect the labor market isn't necessarily clear. It could be that the demand decrease for substitute labor is enormous, while the demand increases from the other two effects, complements and also the labor making the machines. Maybe those are relatively small. That's possible, right? But it could just as easily go the other way around, right? So we need to be very careful when we think about how capital accumulation affects labor markets, because it's not immediately clear. We can break down the effects and say, well, there will be a decrease in demand for substitute labor, an increase for complement labor, an increase for the labor that produces the machinery, but we can't say on the whole what kind of effect this is going to have on labor markets.